Welcome to Betrayed Hearts Chronicles. It started the way most stories do, with something small, something almost imperceptible. Looking back now, I can see the seeds of what was to come, but at the time it seemed innocent. Mundane even. Sophie was late coming home again. I'd made dinner, a modest stir-fry, and had already put the kids to bed. When she finally walked through the door, she carried that same tired yet determined look she always had after a day at the hospital. Her hair was tied back in a ponytail, wisps escaping around her face. Her scrubs hung loosely on her frame, and her shoulders were slumped with exhaustion. "Long day?" I asked, trying to keep the frustration out of my voice. It was the third night this week she'd come home after 8, and I'd spent most of it alone with the kids. "Yeah," she murmured, dropping her bag by the door and leaning against the counter. "We had an emergency valve replacement." It was intense. Her voice carried that far-off tone she often used when her mind was still in the operating room. I'd learned not to push when she got like this. Instead, I handed her a plate of stir-fry, which she accepted with a grateful smile. For a while we ate in silence. The sound of forks scraping against plates filled the space between us. I studied her face, noticing the faint lines around her eyes that hadn't been there a few years ago. She was still beautiful, the kind of beauty that seemed effortless. But there was something else, something I couldn't quite put my finger on. A restlessness. "You okay?" I asked, breaking the silence. She nodded, but her eyes didn't meet mine. "Just tired. It's been a rough week." I wanted to ask more, to press her for details, but I didn't. Maybe I should have. The first time I heard his name was 2 weeks later. Sophie was sitting at the kitchen table, poring over patient files while I washed the dishes. "Matthew Bennett," she muttered, her pen tapping against the table. "Who's that?" I asked casually, turning off the faucet. "A new patient," she replied, barely looking up. "He's a big donor to the hospital. Scheduled for a valve replacement next week. High-profile case." "High profile?" I dried my hands on a dish towel and leaned against the counter. "What, like a celebrity or something?" She shook her head, a small smile playing on her lips. "Not quite. He's just a very wealthy, and very charming, apparently. Everyone's been talking about him." There it was again, that far-off tone. But this time it wasn't just exhaustion. There was something else. Amusement? Admiration? Couldn't tell. The first time I met him, I wasn't impressed. It was at the hospital gala, a mandatory event for Sophie as part of her department's leadership. I'd come along reluctantly, nursing a glass of wine and feeling out of place among the polished professionals and philanthropists. Sophie was in her element, flitting from conversation to conversation with the ease of someone who belonged. I, on the other hand, was just a schoolteacher. No one had much to say to me. "Brian, this is Matthew Bennett," Sophie said, pulling me into one of her circles. "Matthew, my husband, Brian." Matthew extended a hand, his smile broad and confident. He was tall, with perfectly styled hair and a designer suit that probably cost more than my car. "Pleasure to meet you," he said, his grip firm. "Likewise," I replied, forcing a polite smile. As the conversation continued, I felt increasingly invisible. Matthew had a way of commanding attention, of making everyone around him feel like they were in the presence of someone important. I could see why people found him charming. But there was something about him I didn't like. Something too polished, too practiced. That night, as we drove home, I asked Sophie about him. "He seems interesting," I said, keeping my tone neutral. She laughed, a light, musical sound that felt foreign lately. "He's harmless. Just another donor with too much money and too much time on his hands." Harmless. I wanted to believe her. But as the weeks went on, I began to notice subtle changes in Sophie. She smiled more, but not at me. She spent longer at the hospital, often citing late-night meetings or emergency cases. And when she was home, she was distant, her mind somewhere else. I tried to push the doubts away, to tell myself I was imagining things. But deep down, I knew something was shifting, something I couldn't stop. Sophie had always been a touchy person. It was one of the things I loved about her. Even after years of marriage, She'd still reach for my hand while we walked, brush a kiss against my cheek in the mornings, or run her fingers through my hair when we sat together on the couch. But lately, those touches had faded, replaced by hurried goodbyes and distant smiles. I told myself it was the stress of her job. Being a surgeon wasn't easy. The long hours, the pressure, the responsibility, it took its toll. But there were moments I couldn't ignore, moments that didn't fit into the neat narrative I'd constructed to explain away the growing distance between us. The first time I saw it, I didn't think much of it. We were at the hospital's annual charity auction, another event I'd been reluctantly roped into attending. Sophie was working the room, as usual, her laughter carrying over the clinking of glasses and hum of conversation. I stayed near the bar, nursing a whiskey and watching from a distance. She looked radiant in her black cocktail dress, her hair swept up to reveal the elegant curve of her neck. And then there he was, Matthew Bennett. He appeared at her side, his presence commanding as always. He leaned in to speak to her, his hand brushing her arm lightly. The touch was fleeting, barely more than a whisper, but I saw Sophie's reaction. The way she tilted her head toward him, her smile softening, her eyes lighting up in a way they hadn't for me in months. I clenched my glass tighter, the warmth of the whiskey doing little to ease the cold knot forming in my stomach. It wasn't a big deal, I told myself. People touched each other all the time. It didn't mean anything. But then it happened again. And again. The second time was at home. Sophie had invited Matthew over for dinner. A gesture she insisted was purely professional. He's been incredibly generous to the hospital, she explained, her tone light, as if it were the most natural thing in the world. It's just dinner, Brian. I'd agreed, albeit reluctantly. The evening started pleasantly enough. Matthew was charming, as always, regaling us with stories of his travels and business ventures. Sophie laughed at all the right moments, her eyes sparkling as she hung on his every word. And then it happened. Sophie reached for the salad bowl at the same time Matthew did. Their hands brushed, lingering for a fraction too long before Sophie pulled away, her cheeks flushing ever so slightly. Sorry, she murmured, avoiding my gaze as she focused on her plate. Matthew's smile widened, but he said nothing. I watched the exchange in silence, my appetite vanishing. It was such a small thing, so insignificant. But the air in the room felt heavier after that, charged with something I couldn't name. By the third time, I couldn't ignore it anymore. I'd stopped by the hospital to drop off lunch for Sophie, something I hadn't done in years but felt compelled to do that day. I wasn't sure what I expected to find. Maybe reassurance that my fears were unfounded, that everything was fine between us. Instead, I found Sophie in the hallway, her hand resting lightly on Matthew's arm as they talked. It wasn't the touch itself that struck me. It was the intimacy of it. The way her fingers curled just slightly, as if she wanted to hold on but knew she shouldn't. The way Matthew leaned into her touch, his expression warm, almost tender. They didn't see me. I stood frozen, hidden around the corner, my heart pounding in my chest. I wanted to march over there, to demand an explanation, but I didn't. Instead, I turned and walked away, the sound of their laughter echoing in my ears. That night, Sophie came home late again. She kissed me on the cheek, her lips cool and detached. Long day? I asked, my voice steady despite the storm raging inside me. Yeah, she replied, dropping her bag by the door. We had a board meeting. Matthew was there. He's really pushing for the new wing to get approved. It's going to be incredible for the hospital. She spoke about him so casually, as if he were just another colleague. But I couldn't shake the image of her hand on his arm, the look in her eyes when she spoke to him. He seems involved, I said carefully. Sophie looked at me, her brow furrowing slightly. Of course he is. He's one of our biggest donors. I nodded, forcing a smile. Makes sense. But it didn't make sense. None of it did. And as I lay awake that night, staring at the ceiling, I couldn't help but wonder. When had our marriage started to feel like this? Like I was on the outside looking in, watching my wife drift further and further away from me? The first time I knew something was seriously wrong, Sophie lied to me. It wasn't an outright, bold-faced lie. Sophie wasn't like that. It was a careful omission, a rearranging of truths. But I felt it all the same. That tiny shift in her tone, the slight hesitation in her voice as she explained why she would be late again. "There's a department dinner," she said, not quite meeting my eyes as she gathered her things by the door. "It's important. Donors will be there. I'll try not to be too late." "Should I come?" I asked, half joking but hoping she'd say yes. Hoping for an invitation that never came. She shook her head quickly. "It's more of a work thing. Not really a +1 kind of event." I nodded, forcing a smile. "Okay, have fun." She leaned in to kiss my cheek, but it felt rushed, obligatory. Then she was gone, the door clicking shut behind her. The silence that followed was deafening. Hours passed. The kids were asleep, and I was alone in the house, the TV murmuring in the background. I couldn't focus on anything. Not the sitcom reruns, not the stack of papers I'd planned to grade. My mind kept wandering back to Sophie. It wasn't just tonight. She'd been pulling away for weeks, maybe months. And I'd let it happen, convincing myself it was just the stress of her job, the long hours, the endless demands. But now, sitting alone in our too quiet living room, I couldn't ignore the gnawing doubt that had taken root inside me. I picked up my phone and stared at the screen, debating whether to call her. But what would I say? That I didn't believe her? That I thought she was hiding something? I had no proof, just a sinking feeling in my gut. And that wasn't enough. Instead, I opened her social media. Sophie rarely posted, but the hospital's account was another story. They chronicled every event, every gala, every dinner. But there was nothing about tonight. No photos, no mentions. It was like the event didn't exist. I told myself it didn't mean anything. Not everything made it online. But the knot in my stomach tightened. Sophie didn't come home until almost midnight. I heard the car pull into the driveway and sat up straighter, my heart pounding. When she walked through the door, she looked different. Not disheveled, exactly, but not her usual composed self either. Her hair was slightly mussed, her lipstick faded. She smelled faintly of wine and something else I couldn't place. "How was the dinner?" I asked, keeping my tone light. She hesitated, just for a second, before smiling. "It was fine. Long but fine. The donors seemed happy." I nodded, watching her closely. "Who was there?" "Oh, the usual crowd," she said, brushing past me toward the bedroom. "Matthew, of course. He's been such a huge supporter lately. It's really making a difference for the hospital." Matthew. His name hung in the air between us like a threat. "That's good," I said, my voice tight. "I'm glad he's so involved." Sophie paused in the doorway, her back to me. For a moment, I thought she might say something, but then she disappeared into the bedroom, leaving me alone with my thoughts. The next morning, I couldn't stop myself. While Sophie was in the shower, I picked up her phone. My hands were shaking as I unlocked it. She'd given me the code years ago, and I'd never had a reason to use it until now. I scrolled through her messages, my heart pounding with each swipe. Most of them were innocuous, conversations with colleagues, reminders about appointments. But then I saw his name, Matthew Bennett. The messages weren't explicit, but they didn't have to be. There was a familiarity in their tone, an ease that felt too intimate. "Last night was wonderful," he'd written. "You looked stunning." Sophie's reply was short but telling, "Thank you. It was nice to get away for a bit." I stared at the screen, my chest tightening. Nice to get away. Away from me, from our life, from everything we'd built together. When Sophie came out of the bathroom, I was sitting on the edge of the bed, her phone in my hand. She froze, her eyes widening as she took in the scene. "Brian," she started, her voice shaky. "What are you doing?" I held up the phone, the messages glaring on the screen. "What is this?" Her face went pale, and for a moment, I thought she might deny it. But then her shoulders sagged, and she sank onto the bed beside me. "It's not what you think," she said softly. "Then tell me what it is," I demanded, my voice breaking. "Because from where I'm sitting, it looks a hell of a lot like you're cheating on me." Sophie didn't answer right away. She stared at her hands, her fingers twisting together in her lap. Finally, she looked at me, tears brimming in her eyes. "I don't know how it got to this point," she whispered. "Neither did I." The days after Sophie's confession were a blur. She swore there was nothing physical between her and Matthew, that it was just a friendship that had gone too far. But the trust between us had already fractured, and I couldn't stop the images in my mind. Her hand lingering on his arm, the stolen glances, the messages. The distance between us grew palpable. We slept in the same bed but might as well have been strangers. I went through the motions at work, my lessons delivered with the enthusiasm of a man dragging himself through quicksand. Nights were worse. Sophie worked late more often than not, and when she was home, the silence between us felt like another betrayal. Then came the night I found the dress. It was a Saturday, and Sophie had gone to a work meeting. An excuse so worn out I'd stopped believing it weeks ago. I tried to distract myself, pouring a glass of whiskey and flipping through TV channels, but nothing held my attention. Eventually, I found myself wandering into our bedroom, the space that now felt foreign to me. I opened her closet, not entirely sure why. Maybe I was looking for answers, some tangible proof of what I already knew in my gut. And then I saw it. A sleek, red dress I'd never seen before, its fabric shimmering faintly under the light. It was expensive, far more extravagant than anything Sophie usually wore. My stomach twisted as I pulled it off the hanger, the scent of her perfume lingering faintly on the fabric. This wasn't a dress for a meeting. This was a dress for someone else. When Sophie came home that night, I was waiting for her. She walked through the door, her face lighting up in surprise to see me still awake. "Brian, you're up late," she said, her tone overly casual. I held up the dress, the question unspoken but clear. Her smile faltered, and for a moment, I saw something in her eyes I hadn't seen before. Guilt. "Where did you find that?" she asked softly. "In your closet," I replied, my voice steady despite the storm brewing inside me. "Who is it for, Sophie?" She hesitated, and that hesitation was all the answer I needed. I threw the dress onto the couch between us, the sight of it making my chest tighten. "It's just a dress," she said finally, her voice barely above a whisper. "Don't insult me," I snapped. "Who are you dressing up for?" "Because it sure as hell isn't me." Her eyes filled with tears, but I didn't care. Anger, betrayal, and heartbreak boiled over, and the words I'd been holding back spilled out. "Is it Matthew? Are you sleeping with him?" I demanded, my voice rising. "Just tell me the truth, Sophie. I deserve that much." For a moment, she said nothing, her face crumpling under the weight of my accusations. And then she nodded, a single, almost imperceptible motion that shattered what little remained of my world. "It's not what you think," she said, her voice trembling. "It's not serious. It just happened, Brian. I didn't mean for it to." I stared at her, the woman I'd loved for over a decade, and felt like I didn't know her at all. The anger drained out of me, replaced by a hollow ache that settled deep in my chest. "Why?" I asked, my voice breaking. "Why would you do this to us?" She sank onto the couch, burying her face in her hands. "I don't know," she whispered. I felt so disconnected. From you, from myself. Matthew made me feel seen. Like I mattered again. Her words cut deeper than any knife. I turned away, unable to look at her. "I'll sleep in the guest room," I said, my voice flat. "I can't do this right now." That night, as I lay alone in the cold bed of the guest room, the memories of our life together played in my mind like a cruel film reel. The laughter, the promises, the moments we thought we'd never survive but did. And now this, I couldn't sleep, the image of that red dress haunting me. The Sophie I thought I knew was gone, replaced by a stranger. And as much as I wanted to hate her, I couldn't, because deep down I still loved her. And that made the betrayal so much worse. Time didn't heal anything. It only seemed to sharpen the edges of my pain, like water smoothing jagged rocks into cruel, cutting precision. Sophie and I existed in the same house, but we were no longer living together. Conversations were curt, polite on the surface but laced with tension. The once familiar rhythm of our lives was broken, replaced by something cold and mechanical. She continued her work at the hospital. Late nights became the norm, though she no longer offered excuses. She didn't need to. I knew where she was, or at least who she was with. Matthew Bennett. The name became a ghost that haunted every corner of my mind. I imagined their meetings, the stolen glances, the quiet moments that were once mine but now belonged to someone else. And worse, I imagined her wanting him, choosing him over me. One night, Sophie came home earlier than usual. I was sitting at the dining table, a pile of ungraded papers spread out before me. She hesitated in the doorway, her expression unreadable. "Can we talk?" she asked quietly. I looked up, surprised. It was the first time she'd initiated any real conversation in weeks. "What is there to talk about?" I replied, my tone more bitter than I intended. She winced, but stepped closer, pulling out a chair across from me. "I know I've hurt you, and I know I can't take that back. But I want to try to fix this." I stared at her, searching for sincerity in her eyes. "You want to fix this? Then stop seeing him." Her silence was deafening. She looked down at her hands, twisting her wedding ring around her finger. "It's not that simple," she said finally. "It is that simple," I shot back, my voice rising. "You're either committed to this marriage or you're not. There is no in-between, Sophie." She met my gaze then, and for the first time, I saw tears in her eyes. "I don't know if I can," she whispered. "I've tried, Brian. I've tried to stay away. But you love him?" I finished for her, the words tasting like ash in my mouth. She didn't deny it, and that was all the answer I needed. After that conversation, things between us deteriorated further. I stopped waiting for her to come home, stopped asking where she'd been. Instead, I focused on the kids, on my work, on anything that could distract me from the wreckage of our marriage. But the signs of her affair were impossible to ignore. I'd see her phone light up with his name when she thought I wasn't looking. Her clothes carried the faintest trace of his cologne, a scent I now associated with betrayal. And then there were the meetings, the ones that started earlier and ended later, leaving me to wonder what she was doing in those long, unaccounted-for hours. One afternoon, while the kids were at a friend's house, I decided I couldn't take it anymore. I needed to know. I'd seen the name of the hotel she'd been frequenting in a confirmation email that popped up on our shared tablet. The address was burned into my mind, and before I could talk myself out of it, I was driving there, my heart pounding in my chest. When I arrived, I parked across the street, my hands gripping the steering wheel so tightly my knuckles turned white. The hotel was upscale, its gleaming glass facade reflecting the late afternoon sun. I felt sick just looking at it. After what felt like an eternity, I saw her, Sophie. She emerged from the revolving doors, her hair slightly mussed, her face flushed. And then he appeared beside her, Matthew Bennett. He placed a hand on her lower back, guiding her toward a waiting car. She smiled up at him, a smile I hadn't seen in months. I couldn't move, couldn't breathe. The scene before me confirmed everything I already knew, but seeing it with my own eyes was a different kind of pain. It was real now, undeniable. That night, Sophie didn't come home until late. I was waiting for her in the living room, the hotel's address written on a scrap of paper in my hand. When she walked in and saw me, her expression shifted from surprise to dread. "Brian," she started, but I held up the paper. "How long?" I asked, my voice hollow. She froze, her eyes darting to the paper and back to me. "Brian, how long have you been meeting him there?" I demanded, my voice rising. Her silence was all the confirmation I needed. I stood, my hands trembling as I stared at her. "You've destroyed us, Sophie. Do you even care?" Tears filled her eyes, but I didn't wait for her answer. I turned and walked away, slamming the door to the guest room behind me. For the first time, I felt like I was truly alone in my own home. The storm came on a Thursday night. I don't know why, but I had been pacing the living room for hours, replaying every argument, every stilted conversation, every betrayal. The kids were at my mother's for the weekend, and the empty house only amplified the sound of my thoughts. Sophie wasn't home yet. Not that I expected her to be. These late nights had become her norm. Around 10 p.m., I got a call. I stared at my phone, the screen lighting up with an unfamiliar number. Something about it felt off. Hesitant, I answered. "Mr. Sullivan?" A woman's voice asked, trembling slightly. "Yes, this is Brian," I replied, my throat tightening. "This is Diane Bennett," she said. The name hit me like a slap. Matthew's wife. "I'm sorry to call you like this," she continued, her voice cracking. "But something's happened. Matthew. He's dead." My knees nearly buckled. I grabbed the edge of the couch for support. "What?" I whispered, disbelief washing over me. "He collapsed," Diane said, her words tumbling out in a rush. "Sophie was with him. They called an ambulance, but he didn't make it. She said she would call you, but I wasn't sure if she did. Sophie hadn't called me." My stomach churned with anger and dread. "Where is she now?" I managed to ask. "At the hospital," Diane said. "They're asking questions, Brian, about why he was at her apartment, about what happened before he collapsed." Her apartment? The words sliced through me, each one heavier than the last. I thanked Diane, hung up, and grabbed my keys, my hands trembling as I started the car. When I arrived at the hospital, the fluorescent lights felt harsher than usual, casting everything in a cold, unforgiving glare. I spotted Sophie in the waiting area, her head in her hands, her hair disheveled. She looked up when she heard my footsteps, her eyes red and swollen. "Brian," she started, standing up, but I held up a hand to stop her. "Don't," I said, my voice shaking with barely contained rage. "Just tell me what happened." Tears welled up in her eyes. "He collapsed at my apartment," she admitted, her voice barely above a whisper. "I didn't know what to do. I tried CPR, I called 911, but he died." I finished for her, my voice cold. "And now everyone knows he was at your apartment. Do you have any idea what you've done, Sophie?" She reached out to me, but I stepped back, her touch now something I couldn't bear. "I didn't want this to happen," she said desperately. "I was going to end it, Brian. I swear I was." I laughed bitterly, the sound hollow and sharp. "End it? You've already ended everything. Our marriage, our family, my trust in you, and now his life." Sophie flinched as if I'd slapped her. "That's not fair," she whispered. "Fair?" I snapped, my voice rising. "Fair went out the window the moment you decided to invite him into our lives, Sophie. Into our home. Into your bed." A nurse appeared, her expression wary as she glanced between us. "Excuse me, but we need to ask Dr. Sullivan a few more questions." Sophie nodded mutely, her shoulders slumping as she followed the nurse down the hallway. I stood there, frozen, the weight of everything crushing me. Later that night, Sophie came home. She looked hollow, like a shell of the woman I once knew. She dropped her bag by the door and sank into the armchair across from me. "Matthew's wife is threatening to sue," she said quietly. "She's claiming malpractice, negligence, anything to blame someone for what happened." I stared at her, my emotions too tangled to parse. "And what about us?" I asked finally. "Is there anything left of us to salvage?" Her silence spoke volumes. She lowered her gaze, unable to meet my eyes. "I don't know," she said eventually, her voice barely audible. "I don't know how to fix this." Neither did I. For the first time in our marriage, I felt like I didn't know the woman sitting across from me. And worse, I didn't know if I wanted to. The days after Matthew's death were a haze of grief and interrogation. The hospital launched an investigation into Sophie's role in his care, and Diane Bennett's threats of legal action loomed like a storm cloud. I stayed home more often, trying to shield the kids from the chaos, but the tension in the house was impossible to ignore. Sophie moved through the days like a ghost. Her energy, once electric and confident, was replaced by an aura of defeat. She barely spoke, barely ate. I should have felt sorry for her, but all I could feel was anger. a simmering rage that grew with every reminder of what she had done. It wasn't until a week later that the real revelations began. I was cleaning up after dinner, the kids upstairs playing quietly, when Sophie walked into the kitchen. She looked hesitant, her hands fidgeting with the edge of her sweater. "Brian," she started, her voice barely above a whisper. "We need to talk." I put the dish I was scrubbing down, drying my hands slowly. "About what?" She hesitated, her gaze dropping to the floor. "About Matthew. About everything." I leaned against the counter, crossing my arms. "Go on." She took a deep breath, her shoulders trembling. "It wasn't just about him making me feel seen. I thought it was at first, but it became something more. He said he loved me, Brian. And for a while, I thought I loved him too." Her words were like a punch to the gut, but I stayed silent, letting her continue. "But he wasn't who I thought he was," she admitted, tears glistening in her eyes. "Matthew was charming, yes, but he was also manipulative, controlling. He made me feel important, but it came at a cost. He started making demands about my time, my attention. He even threatened to go public if I tried to end things." I stared at her, my anger replaced by a cold, hollow ache. "So what? You're the victim now." Her head snapped up, and she shook her head vehemently. "No, I made my choices. I'm not trying to excuse what I did. But you deserve to know the whole truth." I clenched my jaw, my hands balling into fists at my sides. "Did you ever think about us? About the kids? Or was it all just about you and him?" She flinched at the venom in my words, tears spilling down her cheeks. "Of course I thought about you. I hated myself for what I was doing. Every day I told myself I would stop, that I would fix this. But I didn't know how." The room fell silent, the only sound the faint laughter of our children upstairs. I turned away from her, gripping the edge of the counter as I tried to steady my breathing. The betrayal was too much, the weight of it suffocating. Then Sophie spoke again, her voice trembling. "There's something else. Something you need to know." I turned back to her, my chest tightening. "What now?" She hesitated, her lips trembling. I think I might be pregnant." The air seemed to leave the room. I stared at her, my mind racing. "What?" I managed to choke out. "I don't know if it's yours or his," she admitted, her voice breaking. I haven't told anyone else yet. I just found out a few days ago." Her confession hit me like a tidal wave, knocking the breath out of me. The anger, the pain, the betrayal. It all mixed into something unrecognizable. I couldn't speak, couldn't think. All I could do was stare at the woman who had once been my everything and wonder how we had ended up here. That night, I slept in the guest room again, though sleep never came. My mind was a whirlwind of questions with no answers. What would we do if the baby wasn't mine? Could I forgive her? Could I stay? By morning, I knew one thing for certain. The woman I thought I knew was gone, and the life we had built together was crumbling, one revelation at a time. The tension between Sophie and me had reached a breaking point. After her revelation about the pregnancy, the house felt like a battleground where every word, every glance, carried the weight of our unraveling lives. We moved through the days like actors in a play neither of us had signed up for, each of us pretending not to see the wreckage around us. I tried to convince myself I could endure this, for the kids, for the family we had built. But the doubt gnawed at me. What if the baby wasn't mine? Could I raise another man's child while carrying the knowledge of Sophie's betrayal? Every time I looked at her, I saw Matthew's shadow lurking in the background, his presence poisoning every interaction. One evening, as the kids were playing in the backyard, Sophie approached me. She looked pale, her face drawn tight with a mixture of exhaustion and determination. "Brian, we need to talk," she said, her voice trembling. I was tired of talking. Every conversation felt like another wound, another reminder of the life we'd lost. But I nodded and followed her to the living room. She sat on the edge of the couch, wringing her hands. "I got the results back," she said quietly. "The baby, it's not Matthew's." Relief flooded through me, but it was short-lived. The knowledge that the child was mine didn't erase the betrayal, didn't undo the months of lies and deceit. What does that change? I asked, my voice flat. It means we can fix this, she said, her eyes pleading. We can try to move forward, Brian. For us, for the kids, for the baby. Her words hung in the air, heavy with hope I couldn't share. Do you even hear yourself? I asked, my voice rising. You think a paternity test erases everything you've done? You think we can just go back to the way things were? She flinched but didn't look away. I know it won't be easy. I know I've hurt you, but I'm willing to do whatever it takes to make this right. I laughed bitterly, the sound hollow and harsh. Make it right? How, Sophie? By pretending this never happened? By ignoring the fact that every time I look at you, I see the man you chose over me. Tears streamed down her face, but I couldn't stop. Months of anger and pain spilled out, each word a dagger aimed at the heart of our broken marriage. I loved you, I said, my voice breaking. I trusted you, and you threw it all away for what? A man who's dead now? Was it worth it, Sophie? Was he worth losing everything? She didn't answer. Instead, she buried her face in her hands, her sobs muffled but unmistakable. Part of me wanted to comfort her, to pull her into my arms and tell her we could survive this. But the other part, the part that had been shattered by her betrayal, kept me rooted in place. That night, I packed a bag. Sophie watched from the doorway as I threw clothes into a duffel, her expression a mix of desperation and resignation. Where are you going? She asked, her voice barely above a whisper. I need space, I replied without looking at her. I need time to think. What about the kids? She asked, her tone tinged with panic. I'll still be here for them, I said firmly. But I can't be here for you. Not right now. She didn't try to stop me as I walked out the door, but the sound of her sobs followed me down the hallway. I drove aimlessly for hours, my mind a whirlwind of emotions. Anger, sadness, betrayal, and underneath it all, a hollow ache that refused to go away. Over the next few weeks, I stayed at a friend's house. Sophie and I communicated only about the kids, keeping our conversations short and clinical. I could tell she was trying, sending messages about counseling, about rebuilding, but I couldn't bring myself to engage. The wounds were too fresh, the pain too raw. One afternoon, I stopped by the house to pick up the kids for the weekend. Sophie was in the kitchen, her face pale and drawn. As I helped the kids gather their things, she approached me hesitantly. Brian, she said softly, I'm filing for a separation. Her words caught me off guard, but I nodded. It's for the best, I said, surprised at how steady my voice sounded. I don't want this, she said, her voice cracking, but I understand if you do. I didn't respond. What was there to say? We were already broken, and no amount of words could fix what had been destroyed. As I drove away with the kids in the back seat, I felt an odd mixture of relief and sorrow. The chapter of my life with Sophie was coming to an end, and though it was painful, it also felt inevitable. Some things couldn't be mended, no matter how much you wanted them to be. The courtroom was colder than I expected. The pale walls and stiff wooden benches seemed to drain the life from everyone inside. I sat at the plaintiff's table, my lawyer flipping through papers beside me. Across the room, Sophie sat with her attorney, her face pale and drawn. We had barely spoken in the weeks leading up to this moment, and now we were about to make the final cut that would sever our lives for good. The judge entered, and the room stood briefly before settling into tense silence. As the proceedings began, I felt a strange numbness settle over me. My lawyer outlined the terms we were requesting: shared custody of the kids, a fair division of assets, and a clean break. Sophie's attorney countered, but the arguments felt distant, like white noise. The real fight came when Sophie's affair was brought into the discussion. My lawyer, a sharp and unrelenting professional, didn't hold back. Your Honor, he began, his voice firm. The defendant's extramarital affair not only caused the dissolution of this marriage but has also raised questions about her judgment, particularly regarding the well-being of the children. Sophie's lawyer bristled. Your Honor, while my client acknowledges her mistakes, It is inappropriate to suggest that her actions in a personal capacity have any bearing on her fitness as a parent. The judge looked between us, her expression unreadable. Let's keep this focused on the matters at hand. Parenting agreements, division of property, and financial support. But it was too late. The tension in the room was palpable, and every word felt like a fresh wound being pried open. The custody agreement was the hardest part. I wanted to protect the kids, to shield them from the fallout of Sophie's choices, but I also knew they needed their mother. We eventually agreed on shared custody, alternating weeks with as much consistency as possible. It felt fair on paper, but nothing about it felt fair in reality. The financial negotiations were another battlefield. Sophie had offered to give up the house, knowing it would be better for the kids to stay in the home they were used to. But her guilt seemed to drive her to extremes, offering more than what was necessary. My lawyer insisted I take what she was offering, but it felt wrong, like a hollow victory. "You're entitled to this," my lawyer told me. "Don't let guilt cloud your judgment." But guilt wasn't the problem. I didn't want to win. I just wanted my life back, and no amount of financial gain could restore what had been lost. The divorce was finalized on a rainy afternoon. I left the courthouse feeling lighter, but not in a good way. It was the kind of lightness that comes from losing something heavy, something that once gave you purpose. Sophie lingered outside the building, her umbrella barely shielding her from the downpour. She looked at me, her eyes searching for something. Forgiveness, maybe, or closure. "I'm sorry," she said, her voice barely audible over the rain. I nodded. My own voice stuck somewhere in my throat. "So am I." It wasn't enough, but it was all we had left to say. In the months that followed, life moved on. The kids adjusted to the new routine, though I could see the confusion and sadness in their eyes. I threw myself into work, trying to rebuild some semblance of normalcy. Friends and family reached out, offering support, but the loneliness lingered like a shadow. Sophie and I maintained a cordial relationship for the sake of the kids. Drop-offs and pickups were polite but distant, our conversations stripped of the intimacy and warmth they once held. She seemed to be trying, attending therapy and focusing on her career, but the cracks in her armor were still visible, and I wondered if she felt the same emptiness I did. One night, as I sat alone in the house, surrounded by the silence of a life that no longer felt like mine, I realized something. I had survived. It wasn't the life I wanted, and it certainly wasn't the life I'd planned, but it was mine. And for the first time in months, that felt like enough. The finality of the divorce didn't erase the pain or the memories, but it gave me a chance to start over, to figure out who I was outside of Sophie, outside of us. And though the road ahead felt uncertain, it also felt like a chance to find something new, something real, because sometimes the only way to heal is to let go. Dear listeners, please share your thoughts in the comments, and do not forget to like, share, and subscribe to the channel.